modern slavery or human trafficking is when traffickers or the criminals use people and exploit them for profit.
Why is this important to know in the United States? Because approximately 1 million people in this country are living this way. There are more illicit massage parlors in Houston than combined Starbucks and McDonald's.
Do you know what time they're the busiest? It's lunchtime. It's white-collar customers going there during lunch. They need to have a culture where trauma is accepted and understood, and the impact of trauma, how it shows up mentally and physically for people. If we really want to allow trafficking survivors to have a life, to build a life, to have gainful employment, leaders have to understand what are their challenges. I'm Wendy Fong, and my definition of belonging is that it's a feeling of warmth surrounding the acceptance of your true self so that you can melt and disappear into it.
Wendy Fong, welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It is so wonderful to meet you in person. You are the owner of a company. You have a consulting firm.
Yes.
It's called Chief Gigs.
Yes, I do.
And tell us about what this does.
So Chief Gigs is a talent and strategy advisory firm. And I love making the work world better just because we spend more time at work than at home. And every time I've had a not so positive work experience, I've kind of seen how it could have been better. And so I'm someone who really can look at gaps and then take action to correct it. And so I decided I want to do that for organizations. And so that's what we do in our consulting practice.
One of the things that you talk about and that you're passionate about is modern slavery.
Yes.
And so today we're going to talk about modern slavery and why it's important to have this conversation. I'm already getting emotional, as I always do when things like this kind of touch my heart. And why it's important to talk about it because of the impacts in the workplace. But before we go into the facts, can you just talk a little bit about what the heck modern slavery even is?
Sure. So modern slavery or human trafficking is when traffickers or the criminals use people and exploit them for profit. And so there are two primary ways or two categories that they exploit them is labor and sex trafficking. And under those are a lot of other things underneath. With human trafficking, there has to be either force, fraud, or coercion for it to qualify as human trafficking. And there's definitions for each of those. So force is, self-explanatory, physical harm, beating, rape, sexual assault, physical restraint. That typically happens at the beginning of a trafficking relationship to break the person. Fraud is when there are false promises related to a relationship, like a work relationship, the wages, what the work will entail, maybe a romantic relationship, a marriage. And then coercion is more about the psychological manipulation that goes into it.
Wow. First off, for people who feel very distant to this issue, how do people start to become even aware of this? And you say this is happening in neighborhoods all across the country that few people are even aware. You talk about how there are more illicit massage parlors in Houston than combined Starbucks and McDonald's.
There's another mind-blowing fact. Do you know what time they're the busiest? It's lunchtime. It's white-collar customers going there during lunch. And it's shocking when I learned that too. Yeah.
This gives such a different perspective of going back into a meeting after lunch, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes. And it's so transactional for them. And that's why one of the really great things that the anti-trafficking community is doing is demand reduction, really educating the buyers to say, hey, these people aren't here, on their own will, and not looking at it like I'm just getting my nails done during lunch.
So how will I know? How do I know what? I mean, I don't get my nails done, but if I did, how do I know that it's legitimate? How do I know that anything that I'm doing is legitimate at this point?
It is actually really, really hard for the layperson to find out. And sometimes even professionals don't know. But for massage parlors, if you are driving down the street and it's open later than the typical massage place is open, and there's never any cars in front of it, and you're wondering, how does this business stay in business? It's probably an illicit massage parlor because all of the clients park in the back. And once you see this, you can't unsee it, and they start popping up all over the place. And then you start wondering, are these all illicit? And the answer is probably yes.
Well,
on the other hand, there are semi-legitimate places that also offer, these services. And it's difficult to tell if the massage therapists there are doing it, or are they on, willingly or not. Right. So one of my friends, she's actually a massage therapist, and she took her friends, a couple, to an Asian massage place in Chinatown in Houston. And she'd gone there many times before and, gotten the just a regular massage. And so she recommended it to her friends. Then when they were done, her friend's husband looked white as a sheet, and they were asking him what's wrong, but he didn't really want to say. He just wanted to leave. And so when he got out, that's when he told them that they had touched him and tried to offer him additional services. But that shocked my friend, who is a massage professional. Like, why would she? Even she couldn't tell. So it's really hard for the common person.
The most prevalent countries for modern slavery are North Korea, Eritrea, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. According to an organization called Walk Free, 50 million people are living in the current day modern slavery situation. That's remarkable. Why is this important to know in the United States? Because approximately 1 million people in this country are living this way. Globally, there are only 11 countries adequately providing long-term support for victims who are identified and willing to come forward. And in 72 different countries, certain groups like migrants or domestic workers, probably in this country, are not allowed to unionize.
And one of the biggest things that the general public don't know about selling humans is when there are big sporting events. So think about
I did hear about that.
The Super Bowl, World Cup, even conferences. Houston has this conference called the Offshore Technology Conference, OTC, and it brings in so many people that it increases the demand. And so traffickers transport people in to provide services.
Why is knowing about this important for leaders and organizations?
It's very, very difficult for us as a society to bring to bring into the fold survivors. People go through trauma, and
people do.
And we, through the last few years, trauma has just like skyrocketed exponentially. And
certainly our awareness
yes
to it, and our willingness to see it and to talk about it and to witness it and to acknowledge it has.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think we're just at the beginning, the baby steps, if you will, of that awareness, right? And if we really want to allow trafficking survivors to have a life, to build a life, to have gainful employment, leaders have to understand what are their challenges.
Mm-hmm.
How can they be employed? Yeah.
But why is that important to the bottom line? Why does a leader need to take the time to excavate whether or not this employee, this person has trauma? What's the value of really kind of thinking that through?
Well, they don't need to, right? They don't need to know that this person has trauma. They need to have a culture where trauma is accepted and understood, and the impact of trauma, how it shows up mentally and physically for people. And if you don't, I suppose you can have just all untraumatized people at work, but I doubt that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many people who are affected with trauma, especially this type of complex trauma.
Yeah. What are some ways in which organizations can start to think about their culture so that they can create, a greater sense of belonging for folks who have had really difficult experiences, even as adults?
So the Office for Victims of Crime is a government entity, and they actually have enlisted survivors to become management consultants, if you will.
Wow.
And so this project is called Survivor Engagement Training and Tactical Assistance.
Amazing.
It is amazing. And they actually come to your organization and provide reviews on your policy, on training, so that your organization is ready to employ survivors.
That's fantastic.
It is fantastic.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, what kind of harm could one do if one wasn't thinking?
So they could re-traumatize or re-victimize in the individual. Unfortunately, victims of long-term trauma have a different sense of boundaries, and they can put themselves in harm's way again and get re-triggered and re-victimized. I would say that, understanding everybody goes through trauma, having the cultural humility to know that the differences of the types of trauma, and to know that there can be triggers, as a leader, to know that someone may have a trigger and they don't get to choose their response. They might act out, they might freeze, they might, leave, right? In the case of your retreat. And so, but having the repercussions of that not be termination. Being able to work with that person to understand how can we support you better.
I think there's an opportunity for sure to get really clear about how to engage with somebody and how to engage with everyone really on your team, and to get that kind of custom tailored experience.
Right.
Maybe putting together a profile, maybe being able to ask the person, when do you enjoy receiving feedback? What do you feel safe getting appreciations in public? Are you someone who at a retreat would like to hug, or are you someone who likes to fist bump? I actually was at a conference and I was following someone for years who I revered. And when I got to finally meet her in person, I was like, "Oh my God, you're here!" And I went to hug her, and she backed away and put her fist out, and we fist bumped. And it didn't even occur to me that they might not want to hug.
So actually, I see that often because the CEO of our nonprofit that I'm on the board of, she asks before she hugs anybody, can I give you a hug?
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that consent that's being given.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting piece. How does one say no to a CEO when they ask for a hug? I'm just wondering, like, where the power dynamics come into play, right? If I already don't have boundaries, I'm already a victim. I don't have boundaries. I can't say no. I'm already really afraid of touch.
Right.
Now I'm going to accommodate this person's request, even though it's causing an issue for me.
That's a really good point. We actually had that play out in a training that I did with the board of the organization.
Oh, wow.
So I was doing a training on how to really support yourself and others through trauma. And this is something that I developed after I went through breast cancer a few years ago.
Oh, my goodness.
And I'm
so sorry.
That's okay. I have, I was actually learning about trauma and realized that, people who go through trauma, a lot of times they create organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or, that there's a purpose to them, right? And so mine was creating this training to let people know, hey, when people get sick, maybe don't everybody offer food, right? Because that might not be what that person needs.
Yeah.
And so my training shares a story of how, so when I was diagnosed, everybody was offering me food, but I actually have a lot of food allergies. And so it became really overwhelming for me to be like, well, I don't want to turn down this nice gesture, but I do look really high maintenance when I tell you what food I want.
Yeah.
And so I ended up, developing this workshop that told people, look, what I needed was, my behavioral style, I don't love details, and I don't love, one, I hate the telephone, but I also don't love details and following up. And so what I really needed was someone to do research for me and someone to make doctor's appointments for me.
Wow.
Right? If you ask me what I need, I can tell you exactly what I need. Now, somebody else might appreciate all the food, but it's really about treating people the way they need to be treated. And so I was able to outsource all of these chores to my husband because, it gave me anxiety when I was in meetings. Sometimes I'm in all-day workshops, and then the doctor calls back and you don't answer. You can't get a hold of them for 2 more days, right? So my husband, became that proxy for me, and that was really, really helpful. Yeah.
Can you walk us through your training and actually put together a whole playbook for us of, like, how would I sit down and get really clear with myself about what I need, and then how do I communicate that out to the people who really want to support me?
Yes. So the training actually includes a behavioral assessment, right? And so we use the predictive index for the behavioral assessment, and it assesses people on 4 different behaviors: dominance, extroversion, patience, and formality.
Oh, wow.
And so that's why I said, well, I'm not really about the details and following up, right? Because that's how I test. So my profile is actually a maverick. So if you think about the term maverick, you think last minute, go with the flow, do whatever they want kind of person. And so when I got the news, I had a sudden loss of control, which I love. Mavericks love control. And and each time you couldn't get to that phone call, it's just a little less control, right? And a little more loss. And so in understanding that, I understood, okay, well, I can't control it, but my husband, he works for himself as well, and he isn't in all-day meetings. And so if we can even control that piece, give some semblance of control to the individual, how much better would they feel? And so I sort of devised this training where you explain the different personality types, and then we ask the attendee, okay, think about a conversation or someone that you had a difficult conversation with, or someone you wanted to support, and it didn't go quite the way you thought. Now think about where they might be on the spectrum of control and collaboration. So if you're the person who wants to bring the food over, you think about the person that you want to help.
Exactly.
And what you think that they actually would want. Because if you know them well enough to bring food to them, you probably can guess, right? And so you start looking at, so I teach strategies for the different types of people based on their needs. So as a maverick, I have a need for freedom and I have a need for control. So what could you give me that will allow for that, right? Maybe it's, instead of food, just give me a DoorDash gift card. So I have the freedom to choose when I want to do it.
That's really helpful.
Yes.
What's another example? That's great.
So yeah, another example is walks, just offering up, like, and you know, you don't have to say, hey, do you want to meet at 7 p.m. on this day? It's like,
if you want to go for a walk,
I go on walks every day, you know, in the morning.
If you want to join me.
If you want to join me, or I'm happy to come join you.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So really just kind of opening the gateway of choices.
Yes.
One of the things that you talked about was control. We had a clinical psychologist on the show. Well, we had many actually. Dr. Inga Hansen recently was on the show, and she talked about her cycle of helplessness. So she wrote a dissertation on intimate partner violence. But when I saw this, I was really struck by it because I felt like it was completely appropriate and applied to the workplace.
Okay.
When we think about survivors of modern slavery, when you think about individuals who have been trafficked, who have been coerced, forced, manipulated, abused, assaulted, having their rights taken away.
Yes, absolutely.
Their dignity taken away. There's a loss of control.
Absolutely.
How do we start to address that in the workplace? How do we even begin to identify it?
That's a really good question. And, you know, I don't have the answer for that, but I do know that belonging and community is both a good and bad thing for individuals who have been trafficked. So it's a lack of belonging and a lack of stability that they go into, you know, that they may be tricked into this life to begin with, right?
What initiates them down this journey?
Right. This promise of love, this promise of having a place that they belong.
Money, safety, shelter.
Yes.
Consistency, predictability, reliability.
But I think that's the same with a job. That's exactly what you're offering. This community of people who you should like to work with, and you're going to be able to get money, right? So how is that different? You know, and so showing them the healthy way that it really works is for the first step, you know, having them trust that, oh, they really are paying me what they promised to pay me. And, you know, I am not being asked to work without pay. You know, that's a huge difference. So part of it is just building trust with individuals.
How would you propose inviting leaders to start to even ask questions? Like, what are some questions that leaders could ask their people on their team, their employees, their direct reports, their peers, their colleagues, to really understand where they might feel unsupported, where they might feel a lack of care?
I would say that their employees aren't going to tell them, right? That's not something that they will share. But I think anonymous employee engagement surveys do that. There's a lot of times when, those surveys really open up the dialogue to talking about it.
Wow.
And it might not be your supervisor who is having the conversation because since it's anonymous, right? And so, it could be something that you say and that gets picked up and maybe 10 people said it, maybe 15 people said it, and it gets picked up and changed. So I do think that it's not an individual conversation. It's more anonymous because employees need to feel safe.
Yeah, that confidentiality. Yeah. But that's an interesting piece. I almost wonder, does it even make sense for companies to include those types of questions, on employee survey or on employee engagement surveys? Do you feel that we have enough trauma-informed courses at the office? Do you feel supported in ways that are comfortable for you by your boss or leader, right?
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think the onus is, I think that's very specific, and really the onus, if a survivor isn't feeling safe, I think the onus is on them to know what their triggers are and to go to and to have a safety plan and to get the support that they need. And that support may or may not be within the organization, but it's extremely difficult and probably not financially feasible for an organization to provide that level of support.
We talked about getting consent for physical touch and going to an offsite and not seeing someone after, working with them for 4 years on Zoom, right? And then being like, oh my God, hi! And then really slowing down
right.
in that moment of excitement and just checking in. Are you a hugger? That's what I always ask, right? Are you a hugger or are you a fist bumper kind of a thing? So checking in for consent and then really assessing, how is this person struggling, is one thing that I might look for. Where are they taking on too much, right? Where that could be a boundary crossing thing.
Yep.
And really, we have so much to do in the organization, and I want, you to handle all these projects, but this person just keeps saying yes all the time, and now they're starting to look really overwhelmed.
Right. Right. Well, and that's what our training is about, is for leaders to really recognize how they can support their employees through, the employees' trauma, right? So after my training, going back to the reason I was talking about that to begin with was, so one of the attendees talked about, when I was giving strategies of how to support people, he spoke up and talked about the death of his son and how people showed up in that way and what not to do. And at that moment, somebody asked, "Can I hug you?" And he said, "Not right now." And I said, This is perfect. This is perfect.
Yeah.
You both literally just exemplified what we've been talking about here.
Beautiful.
For someone to just say, "Not right now." On the other hand, another attendee came up and said, "I was going to have a talk with an employee who isn't performing very well on Monday, and I think I might restructure that talk."
How? This is great. How? Yeah. What triggered for them? What changed for them?
Based on what I taught about looking at, had this person been performing poorly all this time, or are they going through something and not letting you know?
So getting curious and asking questions, just the basic, I'm noticing that there's been a drop in your performance. Is something going on for you? How can I support you? What might you need?
Exactly.
Do you need a break? No, absolutely.
Everybody needs a break.
Yeah, everybody does need a break. And then what are some ways specific to survivors around practices to create inclusive culture, besides what you've already mentioned?
So many hiring managers might ask inappropriate questions. And so there needs to be training around that. There needs to be
what not to do,
what not to ask, what not to do, but also to protect the identity of those who are victims of trafficking, because many times it'll be obvious. They'll have no work history. You know, when you post a job, what happens? You review resumes, right? And so how do people with no work history get a job? So if they're coming through a certain program or whatnot, that will really out them. So if there's a way to change the policies around that, you know, do all of your positions need work history? You know, or can you be more inclusive of, say, stay-at-home parents or people who've led alternative lifestyles?
Or have huge gaps.
Yes. Many people who are trafficked don't realize that they're trafficked because of the insidious way it's done. They're tricked into this relationship. And so we have, through our training, we've actually had people self-report that they think they're a victim of human trafficking.
So you're saying that I might be trafficked and not even know?
Yes.
I don't even know what to say to that.
So there's this scheme. It's called the boyfriend or the Romeo or lover boy scheme. And someone contacts you, and they can even use AI to look at your social media browsing history to see if you're a prime target for that scheme. Then they might contact you and create a relationship with you, talk with you, build trust with you, and start isolating you from your family and friends. And then they become your boyfriend. You know, they give you that community that you really long for. They tell the victim that they don't fit this life. The life that we live is called the square life. So they don't fit the square life. So they need to, you know, be in this other community.
Well,
and then once they have isolated the victim, then they start, you know, asking them to sell their body. So if they refuse, they might say, you have to pay me back for all this love that I'm giving you, right? Or you need to do this for us so that we can be in a better place. Or they might make it seem like there's no other choice. And that's kind of how they get in. And then they just don't even think they're being exploited. They think, I'm doing this for us. You know, I have, you know, they might think that they have a choice in it and that they chose to do it. And they don't realize that they're a victim.
You said you have a dream. Talk a little bit about this dream. It's a really sweet dream.
So I have a dream, just like Martin Luther King. I knew that there was human trafficking, but when it really hit me was when I went to Cambodia in 2010. And I went, you know, out in the nightlife, and it disgusted me that I saw so many Western men with children, Cambodian children, and it was out in the open. And so I started looking into how different places are fighting, trafficking. And one thing that I had noticed in my travel was that if you go to any developing country, it's mostly Westerners who own Airbnbs or boutique hotels, right? It's not the locals. The locals they don't own the Airbnbs and resorts. So my dream is to build a resort, or, you know, it doesn't have to be giant. It can be a small retreat type thing, and employ survivors of human trafficking so that they can have a work history, so that they can be trained to know how to, food service. That's already happening in the food service training is already happening in Houston. And there's lots of different models, throughout the US. But in my resort, they'll learn everything that you would need to know of how to run a resort. They can either take that experience and move off into wherever they like, or I would like to have a way through microfinance for the survivors to actually buy into the place, for them to be owners.
Like a co-op.
Yes, because you know what? Like locals, they don't get to own things, and this is going to be a chance for them to actually own it, and that sense of community will be so much stronger than the community that they had before, so it would be less likely for them to fall back into the life.
Yeah, for sure. Wow.
So
that's beautiful.
Thanks.
Beautiful. I want to share some resources. There's the National Human Trafficking Hotline for anyone who needs it in the US. 1-888-373-7888 is the number. You can also text that number to 33733, which is Be Free. And this will connect directly to victims and survivors who are critical to offer support services and help you stay safe and get help. There's the organization that you're part of. You're on the board, called United Against Human Trafficking. It's in Texas and Louisiana. Do you want to say a little bit about the organization?
Yeah. So the organization is a really small organization, but they do a lot of big things. One of the best things that I think, just because I love technology, that they do is they've basically used a CRM, Salesforce, and they've connected all of the agencies that serve in the healing process of a survivor, so that they don't fall through the cracks going from agency to agency. And this pathway is what we call it, is being implemented in other states as well.
That's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you must be so proud.
I am.
That's really great. Wendy, thank you so much for being here and for talking about an incredibly difficult topic and sharing some very important insights for people to A, become aware, and B, start to take action. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope that employers will really start to take note and consider possibly going down the route of being open to employing survivors.
I love that.